Hey everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining the AppSec Secrets webinar series brought to you by us, SciCode. So our approach and philosophy to AppSec is that we think of it as more of like a team sport. And what this series really does is it brings together security, it brings together AppSec, dev, and business leaders like yourselves. We're essentially trying to bring all of you together to really flip that script on AppSec and discuss best practices and discuss challenges that you're probably having in the space yourselves as well. My name is Amir Kazemi, and I'll be your host today for this episode, The Future of Application Security from AppSec Chaos to Maturity with ASPM. Super stoked to have security heavyweight Andy Ellis with me right here. Andy's a seasoned tech executive with a lot of expertise in the cybersecurity space. He's been the operating partner at YL Ventures, the advisory CISO at Orca Security, and he's also the author of 1% Leadership, which you'll all receive a free copy of at the end of the webinar. Andy previously served as the Chief Security Officer at Akamai Technologies, where he was responsible for the company's cybersecurity strategy over a 20-year tenure. But in general, just honestly cannot think of a better person to talk to today other than Andy regarding this topic. But yeah, Andy, did I cover everything but regarding your background?
Yeah, I think you covered the high points. I mean, we could go into like the nitty-gritty details, but at some point we just run out of time for the webinar.
For sure. Yeah, let's dive right into it. I wanted to kind of start it a little bit broader, just to kick it off. Let's talk a little bit about the attack surface or the unmanageable attack surface. So how do you think that has kind of evolved over time? And I think it would be good to kind of level set on like what is an attack surface to even begin with.
Yeah, so I think when people talk about the attack surface, we sort of immediately jump to like where are the adversary touch points?
Yeah.
And even before I jump into that, I like to think about where is the center of gravity of our organization, because that sort of drives an attack surface conversation. And that might sound a little strange, but when we think about applications, let's just go back for a little bit, like like widespread internet, like applications where it's a downloaded software. And so your attack surface was the piece of software that you shipped. And you didn't really think about what was behind it, all the development infrastructure, because there was almost none of that. Maybe you started to worry a little about like how you delivered software updates became a touch point. And but over time we've moved from that obviously to an internet-centric model to now like the internet is the business plane. But as we've thought about the attack surface for applications, we're only starting to tackle pieces of what I think of as the true center of gravity, which is the entire software development lifecycle. We've talked about SDLC security, but in the history, we never really talked about the front end of applications as part of the SDLC. And I actually think that they're inseparable. And so look, I'm to blame for this. Like we built WAFs into CDNs to sort of say, oh, look, we'll protect the front end of your applications. And as a result, people are like, well, that's not really part of AppSec. Like, okay, we're dealing with that. We'll do virtual patching. And it let us like deal with things or not deal with things. And then like SBOMs came around and people were like, oh, we just need to know what's the software. And I think all of these become this touch point for the entire SDLC as our attack surface. Because the adversaries aren't just trying to break our running applications. They're trying to seize control of our applications. They're trying to get access to the data. And so you have to think about the whole life cycle of building an application is actually where your attack surface starts.
Yeah, gotcha. And let's say you're a new CISO, like how do you think about or even collect the data or the inventory around that attack surface? Is it, can you aggregate that on a spreadsheet? Do you use a specific tool? Like, how do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of the simple spreadsheet model, which is you always start with a spreadsheet as a new CISO, but your spreadsheet is never going to become detailed. As soon as you need detail, you need to have it in some other tool. But you use the spreadsheet to keep track of the stuff that's not in any other tool. So you might write down like my SDLC, and you should write this question of like, how many systems, for however you want to define system, are in my SDLC? And as you learn that, you might say, oh, here's all the things I have to start tracking, right? I've got to keep track of every source code repository, and oh my God, there's a lot of them. And all of my build systems and all of my developer desktops, and all of these things are part of my SDLC. right? And Slack is part of my SDLC. Like, how many people actually cognitively think about your messaging system
Yep.
is part of your SDLC? But if I can tell a developer to accept a pull request via Slack, that's SDLC for you.
Exactly. Yep. And a lot of the times that goes, unknown, right? That's not even
Right.
covered, or people aren't
It's
thinking
it's
about
it's
that.
really not even covered. And then you're going to want to start to think about the outcomes as well.
Yep.
Right. Like, okay, why am I measuring this? Like, what's the hazard? What's the risk? What am I actually trying to do?
Yep. So how would you say that, this evolution has kind of um, created this thinking around building your security programs? Like, how are you thinking about building these security programs, knowing the evolution of this attack surface?
So I think one thing that people do get a benefit from is there's been this slide that's been shared for like 30 years about the cost of fixing a bug in the waterfall development model. It says, oh, like increases by 10x. Like
Yep.
the later and later you get into it. My favorite thing is there's no actual study behind it. It was literally a thought paper that somebody put out, but it resonates with us and it feels kind of appropriate in a waterfall world. In a non-waterfall world, it really no longer does, because you have to say, look, fixing bugs is not really that expensive if you truly are agile.
Hmm.
It's not fixing bugs is what's really expensive. So how are you detecting and cleaning? What does remediation look like? How is this entirely part of your life cycle? Because I think if your goal is to say we'll never deploy software that has a defect in it, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And too many organizations, I think, have that as an implicit assumption. But I think you need to start to have this explicit thing, which is we need to be able to find defects anywhere from ideation to deployment, and how do we quickly detect, fix, prevent them from going out, especially if we've already fixed them once. I think as a CISO, that's always the most embarrassing thing, is when
Yep.
you do some remediation campaign, you clean something up, and then a new piece of software like came off of a different branch and reintroduces a vulnerability.
Yep. Yep. Um, what about maturity, or like how are you measuring kind of the effectiveness of these security programs?
Yeah, so measurement is hard, and most people focus on measurements of activity rather than measurements of effectiveness, because it's really easy to say, well, how many bugs did we fix?
Yep.
Right? And then you get into I think the Dilbert cartoon of, well, if you measure people on how many bugs they fix, you're incentivizing them to introduce more bugs,
Yep.
right? Which might not be that they intentionally deliberately write bad code, but they're like, oh, I could take this one defect and write it up as 5 bugs, so I fixed 5 defects.
Yeah.
Right. I think the real question has to be like, what do you think is effectiveness? And the effectiveness has to be things like, even if breached, our application doesn't reveal X. So some of it goes into design. How many applications have too much data accessible at the end? And so there's a designer like, how do we remove secrets? How many times have we heard oh, like somebody posted a piece of code on GitHub is an example of their work, but it had keys in it,
Hmm.
right? That demonstrates an ineffective security program. So I
Yep.
think that's almost what you want to start looking for, is say, I'll take keys as this example and say,
Hmm.
or any secret, right? Any secret that is in your code base is a weakness waiting to be exploited, right? It's a hazard that this secret can get out. So one measure of effectiveness becomes like, how many secrets have you gotten rid of? How many secrets are protected by whatever your vaulting solution is? You move them into a vault, you make them accessible only via API, not just written into the code. And the more you do that, the more comfort you feel that you've implemented an effective control. So think about your effective controls and then track implementation, not the activity to keep playing whack-a-mole.
Yeah. Yeah. And are you thinking about that measurement a little bit differently across, the CISO level, the AppSec level, and kind of like the individual level as
Yeah,
well?
Yeah, I think at the CISO level, like you basically want to say, look, we have some set of standards for our code base, and what does adoption look like at the high level, right? What
Sure.
percentage of these standards that are meaningful have we vetted to show they would work? And what parts of our SDLC actually implement those in a way that we're comfortable with, right? And maybe you track that by business unit, and maybe you say, oh, look, here's a new thing we're going to roll out and implement. So the number starts out low and it's going to grow, But as a CISO, you want like one slide about AppSec, and even that's almost too much,
Yeah.
right? You want to be able to just summarize and say end to end, here's what my AppSec program looks like. Here's the high level 12 principles we have, and here's what adoption is. But if I'm
Gotcha.
a developer, I need to go into detail, right? If I'm the AppSec engineer, I've got to be able to go in and say, like, here's specific problems. Here's all the code bases with issues. What are we going to fix? What do we need to write new? Rather than just like, it's not a bug to be fixed if it's an architectural flaw. I think that's the thing a lot of people miss in the AppSec space is sometimes these are defects in how we wrote the software, not in what got written.
Yeah.
If you've written secrets into code, there's not a bug fix here. You need something to manage secrets. That's a new capability.
Yeah, exactly. You need something to manage secrets, but also could also be a cultural thing as well, right?
Right. Yeah, and I'm
Um,
a big fan of looking at organizationally, like where do you have common problems
yeah,
so that you can tackle them. I recall something one of my AppSec manager did at Akamai a long time ago. We went and did a web app analysis, the very standard, hire a third party to come in, and literally they're just doing manual fuzzing. And they find like a million SQL injections and all these problems. And like we know what the right solution is, which is you need to write an input sanitization library and just run everything through the sanitizer. Right?
yeah.
But there's no way that the engineers would have accepted that if we had set that up front. So like, and I can't say that as the CISO, because everybody would listen to me and be like, oh my God, Andy, you're so negative. Why do you not believe this would happen? And I can't say, well, I have a lot of experience, not only with this engineering team, but a lot of them in general.
Yeah.
So what our AppSec engineer did was said, okay, well, I'm going to go give them one to fix. Right. And they went and they did the obvious, like, oh, here's the string that was the exploit. So they literally hard coded into their code, like, that string. And then
Yeah.
as soon as they fixed it, he walked back in with the next one. It was like, oh, here's like the obvious bypass that I'd already had planned for what you did.
Yeah.
And then like the next month brought them like 5 things that were similar. And he kept doing this until they said, we're tired of like playing whack-a-mole. How should we solve this? At which point now we had a conversation. They wrote input sanitization. And now we brought them and said, oh, by the way, you've written this great library. You actually have like 50 different apps that need to use the library.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
it was this campaign that maybe took us longer than it would have if we believed everybody would have done what we wanted right up front.
Yeah.
But they now believed it was their solution. I think it was done faster than it would have been had we just hammered them with like, here's 1,000 findings.
Mm-hmm.
And so my engineer needed to track that. Like they needed access to every one of these defects. I did not. And that's
Yeah.
a really important thing to understand is at different levels, you need different operational visibility.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's super important. You kind of touched on secrets a little bit earlier. We also touched on the attack surface. What about, security controls in general? How do you know which security controls to kind of put in place, given you may know what the attack surface is, right? Like where do you start? Where do you start and how do you kind of think about that?
Yep. So I like drawing on Nancy Levison's work, and I think we're probably a little too tight in for me to like point out the book right above. No, it's right there. It's that blue one that I'm just pointing out here.
Yeah.
It's called Engineering a Safer World,
Okay.
and it's a safety engineering program, not a security engineering program, but there's a lot of parallels. And very simply, you don't have to go buy the book if you don't want to. What you can apply is first talk about unacceptable losses. What
Mm-hmm.
is the bad outcome that could happen? So you look at your AppSec space and you say, like,
Yeah.
what's the worst outcome? Don't think about how yet, right? But you say, okay, we publish all of our customer data gets exposed,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's unacceptable loss. Okay, we all agree on that. And now you can start to talk about the hazards that lead to it. You say, well, inside our system, like our application has access to all of the customer data all at once. Like the application has the ability to pull everything from the database. That's just a hazard. And oh, look, like the administrators can have the application do. Like so you connect these hazards. Then at some point you're like, oh, now I can talk about a scenario. Like what if an adversary, compromises an administrator credential, connects into the application and dumps the table and walks away with it. Like,
Yeah.
does that feel plausible? Absolutely. Like
Yeah.
basically the every breach ever sounds something like that.
Yeah.
And now you can say, okay, what would be the controls that would protect against this? Like I've got this story, simple narrative. It's almost like telling a fairy tale. And like it's Little Red Robin Hood, you're just reversing it and saying, what would we do to stop it? It's like, oh, maybe one thing we want to do is not have the application actually able to look at the entire customer database at once. Like there's no reason that the same application our customers use actually can pull all that data, right? It should be stored queries. It should only be able to pull up one customer record at a time. Like make it a lot harder so you don't have these accidental breaches. They say, okay, on the front end, maybe it's about implementing multi-factor authentication for my administrators, or maybe it's giving my administrators a whole different way to connect and access this data, right? So you just tell these narratives, and once you have the narrative, the controls really pop out at you. Like my favorite ones are always multi-factor authentication. Eliminate as much as you can administrator credential bloat. Right? If there's basically one administrator who has access to every system in your application, or worse, every laptop in your environment, because then you get access to every user. Like those two things are basically what will cripple you. And then you can say, okay, let's look at where is my data? Like how do I isolate my data? And you can just build on top of that.
Yeah, I like that frame of thinking where you talk about, or you kind of start off with, what are the unacceptable outcomes for the business, right? Or the program.
Right.
And then that's how you kind of kick it off. And then do you kind of use that or that frame of thinking to map to the perimeter or the attack surface that
so I
you
think you don't do it directly, but you'll do it indirectly.
Indirectly, okay.
Because you're trying to build what is the sequence, what's the fairy tale about what an attacker could do to exploit hazards from the outside. And somebody who used to work for me, he called it adversary powers. Right? He said, first of all, you assume every adversary has the power to connect to the internet, to send email, and to like run Metasploit. Okay. With those three powers, like what can they do to you to get another power? Like, oh, they can send email that contains, a malicious payload that somebody might click on. And it's like, okay, well, if I'm subject to that vulnerability, like, oh, if you clicked on a payload, you get access to X, great, now the adversary can upscale their power. And at some point they have the power to do a negative thing to me. But you're always aimed at those unacceptable losses. And the reason that's important to think about what the unacceptable losses are is that they don't match to your assets.
Gotcha.
Right? If you start from an asset base, people think about losing assets, and think about the airline industry, right? You can list all of the airline's assets. Passengers' lives are not an asset of the airline. You would never write them down as an asset. But when you think about unacceptable losses, right at the top, killing your passengers. Right. And so now as you think about like, how would you protect an airline? You want to think about, well, what are all of the ways that passengers could die in the care of an airline? And do you have controls that would minimize those hazards?
Yeah, I love that. I love that frame of thinking. And once you kind of establish those controls, how do you get to a point of like, okay, now I have executive trust and it's almost on autopilot in a way, right?
So I think it's pretty rare for people to get to a trusted autopilot. It's often like people don't want to pay attention. And when you think about AppSec, like because companies don't tend to think about the SDLC from end to end as being that center of gravity, AppSec is all too often just thought of as a point problem. Like, oh, we need to do better code reviews. Oh, we need to do better secrets management. Oh, we need to do each of these individual things, but we're not actually thinking holistically. And the more things you have to deal with, the more likely it is that your executives are going to turn a blind eye to you. It's like, oh, we're doing 17 things around AppSec. Well, how many things should you do is not actually their next question. Right? They assume if you've got 17 programs that this is well taken care of, because you would not be investing in 17 programs otherwise.
So I think it's almost inevitable, you tell me, but as you kind of build out more and more controls, you're essentially introducing tool sprawl, or there's too many tools across a program. How are CISOs today, or even AppSec leaders, kind of thinking about managing that or balancing that thought or that program in that respect?
So I think as you're looking at that, like, oh, I've got so many things, is the question always has to be like, what is buying you good defenses? What is effective? And what does run on its own? Like you did talk about, oh, like do you have something that everybody feels comfortable with? Right. And I'm a firm believer that the more you can get the developers to invest in, the better off you are.
Hmm.
So I prefer developer self-service on AppSec tools
Yeah,
way more than having the security team run them.
yeah.
So it's like, oh, if you get the developers to buy in, some of the best, when I was at Akamai, we had a huge set of things around source code security that were actually all built by developers. I would often consult with the developers, but they were the ones that were like, oh, like we need to have authenticated check-ins. Like, and this is, back in 2000, authenticated check-ins were barely a thing. The most common source code repository on the market did not support them. It literally was clear text. Anybody could check it and claim who they are. And our developers were the ones who were like, no, 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 we're going to wrap this in an SSH tunnel, so we can see who actually did the check-in. And they built like this whole thing to do it. And
Yeah.
now I don't have to maintain it. Like it's their solution. And so I
Yeah.
get to think about it as part of my AppSec program, but it's not a tool I'm in charge of. Like I want to run platforms as a CISO. I don't want to run point solutions.
Yeah, yeah. What I mean, and that's an interesting point around kind of that collaboration between dev and security. Um, Oftentimes there's tension, right? So how do you kind of not just minimize that tension, but build a better relationship between the two orgs, especially as a new CISO, a new leader coming into a new role? Like, what are your kind of your thoughts on that?
So I think there's a lot of different ways, but the first is to recognize that if you need somebody else to build and implement a solution, then they need to believe in the problem.
Yep.
And you can't just lecture that your way to get them to believe in it. Like I love doing if it takes me 10 arguments to convince you, well, can I do it in 8?
Mm,
Not that like I'm more efficient, but I leave the last 2 for you.
yep.
Because if like your brain's like, oh, I've got this and this and this, and oh, and this, you believe it way more than if I told you the whole 10. So the
Yep.
more I can get people to finish that argument and do that education and awareness. And then on the flip side, the more it's clear that I understand what's going on the developer side. Often you have a developer productivity or developer tools team that owns the SDLC infrastructure. They're going to
Yeah.
be your biggest partner as a security professional. And if you can find things that would improve security and make their life easier or match with their goals. And here's a simple one, which is if you're a company who's been around for a while, you probably have a lot of legacy infrastructure in your SDLC. Go talk to your dev team and say, hey, what is the actual latency for rolling out software? Like if we need to make a major change, like OpenSSL just drops a new issue,
Yeah.
like what is our wall clock latency?
Yeah.
And what is our cost to get there? And you'll often be shocked at the answer. Like I actually looked at this when I was at Akamai. It's like we actually couldn't roll out software without massive expense that had to go to our whole network. In fact, when it was at its worst, fixed before I left, but at its worst, it was literally we would disrupt one product release. And when I say by disrupt one product release, like you would only get so many product releases a year, and one of them would get taken to deal with a vulnerability. Like
Hmm.
at that point, the developer teams hated me because if I walked in and said, "Oh, we have to fix this," they're
Yeah.
like, "Well, you just destroyed, an entire product release to do that. I mean, everything has now slipped by however many weeks." And so
Yeah.
we championed this set of programs that the developer productivity team had been trying to get prioritized that were all about CI/CD efficiency. Right?
Mm.
They wanted to go in and it's like, okay, we're going to bring down release time by this much. And all of a sudden, like the CISO's in championing release productivity and release efficiency. And when somebody said, like, why are you doing this? I said, well, just do the math on right now when I say we need to fix something, I have to spend like 3 weeks fighting the whole company to convince you, not because you don't want to fix stuff, but because the cost is so high. If I can bring that cost down, you won't fight me.
Hmm.
And like you believe it needs to be fixed, and now you'll just go do it.
Yeah. It's also you're kind of putting yourselves in their shoes, right? Trying to help
Right.
them improve the developer experience overall. So
Yeah. And one of my favorite things is like if you're in the same meetings with different people and you hear what their common critiques are, either of your requests or other people's, When you're next time you're in a meeting, if you know what they're going to say, what they're going to object to, say it for them. Like if you've got one of my best partners, she was responsible at the time for like professional services. Like, oh, we need to fix this thing in how our application works, but it's going to require our customers to all make a change. Right. And the first time it did, she's like, well, here's what the cost will be. Every professional services person interacting with every customer, boom. And then going forward, I would just always say, oh, have we thought about the impact on professional services for this proposal? I now have an ally who's like, oh, you see me, you know what my pain is. Even if you're not saying that's too much, you're at least asking the question for me.
Yeah.
And then I would know if I wasn't in the room, she'd be like, well, is this secure? Like, does this meet our security requirements? Because I was speaking the language of someone else. And so the more you can speak the language of the developer, like what is their actual pain point, the more likely you can drive an AppSec program that they will appreciate.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. Kind of coming back to the security controls topic, obviously tool sprawl is a thing.
Yep.
How do you think that has affected visibility for security teams in general?
So I think a big challenge is if you're a security team,
Yeah.
going and interacting with different tools is a pain.
Yeah.
So some teams, if they're really big, like you have the team that manages the tool and like they're each prioritizing their own thing. But if you're not looking at that in an integrated way, what'll happen is you have your person who's looking at the pen testing results and they come to a development team and say, here's all of my findings from this pen test, go fix them.
Mhm.
But they're walking in like the day after the compliance team showed up and said, here's all of our findings about how you're not satisfying the processes we wrote down for SOC 2.
Yeah.
Right. And then your SaaS team comes in. It's like, here's the application security, all the defects we found looking at your code.
Mhm.
And so you start working at cross purposes when you have this sort of sprawl.
Yeah.
And honestly, most tools suck at helping developers read them and decide what to do. Right?
Yeah.
We use this phrase alert fatigue a lot in the industry. And first, actually, I want to say the fatigue is real. I hate the fact that we call it alerts. I came out of an ops background. Alert means drop what you're doing and go solve this.
Yeah.
It's like an alert is you have been breached, something is down, like incident.
Yeah.
You ran a source code analysis tool and found that I did a thing that maybe I shouldn't do. It's not an alert. And yet that's what most tools are doing is they're giving you hygiene findings, and they're important hygiene findings. I don't want to minimize all of them, but I
Mhm.
do recall I was told once I had a system that did a port scan and vulnerability analysis and said we needed to turn off ICMP timestamp replies,
Yeah.
which I'm actually in favor of doing. Like I don't need to do this. Why am I doing the processing at all? But the argument was somebody would know what time was on my servers. I'm like, have you not heard of NTP? Pretty sure everybody knows what time is running on all of my servers because I have an NTP constellation that works. And in the early parts of my career, and I see people repeat this, you get this report from your tool and you hand it to a developer and say, fix everything. And they see 1,000 things and they're like, no, please prioritize. And they will argue with you for months over whose job it is to prioritize the list of things.
Between security and dev.
Between security and dev. And
Yeah.
now nobody's actually fixing. And think about like how much time we waste arguing about whether this should be done before that. And now it's 1,000 things. Like it's worth that argument if you're the developer. But in the meantime, nothing is actually getting fixed.
Yeah. That brings up the topic of prioritization. Like, who owns prioritization? Like, who owns prioritization? And how do you actually narrow down to the right critical alerts when you have all this tool sprawl, when you have this alert fatigue, right? There's this
Right.
constant mess, which we call AppSec chaos. So how do you,
Yes.
focus on the right things?
So ultimately, I actually think that the dev team owns prioritization. And I know any developer who's listening is going to be like, well, you're just saying that because you're InfoSec. But I actually do mean that I think they own it, but I think they should also own the tools. And the problem is like we bring the tools, and since they own the prioritization, there's no incentive on us to fix the prioritization that the tools are providing. So to solve this, like the tools need to have the context, they need to help and say, look, here are the things you should go fix right now. Like you have 5 minutes, go fix this thing. Like if you're building a tool, that should be the number one thing in your dashboard is like, you know what level someone is in the organization, assume they only have 5 minutes, what should they do with it? If it's
Hmm.
the CISO, it's like, who do you call? Like I have 5 minutes, my single greatest power is the ability to pick up the phone. And so if you said, you need to pick up the phone, call this engineering manager and say, your team hasn't fixed anything in 6 months. Like that's the most effective thing I can do with 5 minutes of my time.
Yeah.
Arm me for that phone call.
Yeah.
But if I'm a developer who pops in, it's like, you have 5 minutes. It's like, hey, we have an input sanitization library that you are not using. Here's how to integrate it. Like, here's our recommendation and best practice. Or we're doing tokenization. Here's our thing. But what is that 5 minutes?
Hmm.
And then the next thing is like, what does my path look like? You have to sell people on a vision, not a
Yeah.
treadmill. Because if I say, look, what I need from you every day is fix one bug, you're like, I'm not really excited by that. But if I come to you and I say, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have an application that's going to look like this from a security and safety perspective. People will trust it with their data. Like you can get on board with that when I say, we're going to be implementing a vault for all PII. We're going to be removing all secrets from code. Like here's the list of things we're doing. And you as the developer, like you can have some say in how those get rolled out to you. Like when do you want each one maybe?
Yeah.
Or do you want to roll them out to all of your apps at once, or do you want to pick an app? In fact, on the pick an app point, this is the thing I feel like I've been fighting with every security person my entire career, which is if you have more than one application in your environment, which I'm sure almost everybody does,
Yeah.
and you're like, here's this critical problem that we want to go fix across all of our applications. You should never try to roll it out to your flagship applications first.
Yeah.
I know that's where all your data is. You want to go protect it, but everybody will fight you. It's like, no, go to marketing and be like, hey, you've got this web app. We're going to roll out this privacy vault code for you. And they're going to be like, I don't have any privacy data. We're like, great.
Yeah.
Like we're going to roll it out. It should have no impact on you, but we just want to make sure it works on our platform and everybody's comfortable with it. Or let them pick. Be like,
Yeah.
I don't care. Roll it out to some set of applications. At some point, we'll go after the flagship, but the flagship should never be first.
What in terms of remediation, where are the developers like expecting? So prioritization is done, for
Yep.
example, right? You're getting, down to the right critical alerts. But what about remediation? Like, how do you get 10,000 person organization? How are you getting the right alerts to the right people in the most efficient manner? I think that's, a hot topic right now.
Oh, that it absolutely is. And so many organizations, it's just the institutional memory of some program managers inside the security team. They're like, oh, I know that this application is owned by Amir. And so I'll call Amir and say, hey, I got some stuff for you. Like, we need to get to programmatic remediation where we can identify a problem.
Yeah.
We know that like here's what needs to be fixed. We know who needs to fix it. We can give them like, here is your dashboard. So Amir, here's all of the problems in your environment. Like you don't need a security person to collect that data for you. It's just automatically all there. Like that's step one. And
Yeah.
then we say, okay, now you need to start remediating. So how can we make it that you're doing the same remediations at once? So it's like,
Hmm.
oh, we're going to do secrets removal, like, or give you the choice to be like, here's 12 different problems across the 10 apps you're responsible for. You got to fix 120 things. Do you want to fix one problem across all 10 apps, or do
Yeah.
you want to fix all 12 problems in one app? Like that should be your choice. But right now, like the humans that interact with you sort of decide for you, except what they really decide is like, what's the direct ordering of the 120? And so
Hmm.
it's almost the least efficient way to remediate.
Yeah. Got it. There's an emerging trend, and obviously, like this acronym called ASPM,
Yep.
Application Security Posture Management, and I feel like this kind of category has evolved over time. Uh,
Very much so.
yeah. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on like, you know, the crux of it is like, it's all about visibility, prioritization, remediation. How are you seeing CISOs kind of evolve their practices and their programs to implement and adopt, platforms like ASPM tools?
Yep. So I think we're really in the early stages. of the ASPM migration. And it's probably worth looking at the CSPM world to say what might it look like, right? And in CSPM, what we saw was the first iteration of it, which is really matches the second iteration of ASPM, is look, we'll just tell you what all your problems are. Like we have an easy way to collect them in one place.
Yep.
And like cloud had that easy. It was like, oh, look, we just connect to AWS or GCP and we like pull everything, we do some analysis and we hand you everything wrong in your cloud. Have a nice day.
Yep.
And then we'll start doing that context to figure out what's happening. And all of a sudden CSPM becomes this new space that's called CNAPP, Cloud Native Application Protection. And I think ASPM is at the beginning of doing that change. Like the first iteration of ASPM, which people no longer really talk about, was like inventory of tools and environments you apply them to. Like we're not even going to measure like how effectively you're doing something. It's more like have you rolled out the right tools to the right place? And so I think that's sort of the old school world. And now the new world say, okay, let's take that knowledge of here's all the tools you should have to protect your whole SDLC and start pulling that data all together in one place. And now start to figure out like, how does this connect? And it'll be interesting to see, I think, will ASPM, sort of continue taking the same leap as CSPM? Are they going to run into each other potentially someday? I'm always worried about like what spaces will run into which spaces in the future, because there is some overlap. Like if you do ASPM right, it will obviously include a whole bunch of elements of CSPM. I think the converse isn't necessarily true because not every application will be in the cloud.
Yeah. And wouldn't you say that CSPM brought to light kind of the visibility that AppSec eventually needed, right? That evolution into ASPM.
Right. And I think, and you do see some of ASPM capabilities in the CSPM world. And I think that's one reason that has caused Gartner and others to start redefining ASPM to say you have to be able to deal with the problems across from the moment the developer thinks of them and starts typing them until they're deployed. Like this is not separate problems. It is one problem space.
Yeah. Kind of tying ASPM to security controls. I think there's an opportunity for CISOs, in terms of, consolidation of some of their tools. And ASPM is one avenue or one way to kind of provide some of that consolidation, either through using native tools that a vendor provides or using your third-party tools. Do you have any thoughts on kind of the balance between like which ones I should rip and replace, or what I should do across my AppSec program to kind of drive some of that efficiency?
Yeah, so I think the way that I look at it is you should figure out how much value you're getting out of a tool.
Yeah.
And that feeds into your rip and replace. Like if you have some legacy tool that you're not getting any value out of, like you should be like, let's rip and replace this.
Yeah.
But if you got something that's providing value, maybe you wait. But you should always be strategic. Like I'm a fan of saying, look, if I've got 12 tools, I want to have a platform there. Like I do not want different tools. Now, it might be that I end up with like 6 tools that I'll feed into one platform, and I'm okay with that because that's now only one security system. Like it doesn't matter how many vendors I have, it's how many touch points I'm actually going to use to run my security program.
Yeah.
But if I know where I'm going to go, then my goal is to say, okay, what's the sort of the easiest path to get there? Because if I'm doing a big change, I want to be able to show value as early as possible in the change. So it might be that I'm adding a new layer on to collect a bunch of data points in, and then I'm going to start ripping out old systems, but nobody will really notice it because they're only interacting with my platform that shows all the data. It's like, oh, I need to replace my SAST vendor over here, and I'm going to do something else. But the developers don't see it because they don't care where this result came from as long as it's always coming through the same spot.
Yeah. That you bring a good point on the developer side. Is there a developer productivity tax with too many of these AST tools?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Like that's why I don't want I want the development organization to own AppSec as much as possible.
Yeah.
Individual developers should only have one dashboard. Like that's should be our ultimate vision, which says, here's the software you own.
Yeah.
Here's all of the problems in it. Here's the ones you should fix next. Here is your rating. Like imagine if I'm the CISO, right? And I can go to the board and say, I'm going to give our company a grade of 84%, like whatever that means. And I suspect with, Tim Brown, coming under an SEC for prosecution, we're going to have more CISOs who want to be very concrete about, oh, here's all the bad findings.
Yeah.
Well, I want you as a developer to be able to go into the same tool I used and get your personalized score that says like, oh, the company is at 84% and you are at 62%. Whatever those numbers mean, let's not debate those for today.
Yeah.
But you are dragging the company down. You see this, your boss sees it, and like you get it aggregated by organization. So your boss can be like, well, Amir is at 62%, Karina next to him is at 75%. I know who's getting a better bonus this year.
Yeah.
Amir, you'd better like deal with this because clearly you're not prioritizing security, and the board is all over us and the CEO's all over us for having bad security.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. I think what we'll do at this point, Andy, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and see if we can take a question or two.
Okay.
Looks like we've got one question here from the audience. So, from a CISO point of view, what are some of the most important metrics you need your AppSec program to report on? And do you need to take those to the board meetings, or do you need to kind of report on those to the board or the exec team? And how are you kind of thinking about that?
So eventually it should be going to the board in some fashion, but not necessarily up front. The the first metric is coverage. Like how many applications do you have
Yeah.
and what is your coverage of visibility and of controls? Right? And start with it. And this is the hard part is most people don't want to be like, "Oh, there's 75 applications out there that I have no visibility into." But you
Hmm.
need to write that down. If you're unwilling to say what you know you don't know, then you're never going to find out what you don't know that you don't know. Like if I
Yeah.
write down, I've got 75 apps that I don't know what's going on here, and I can list them, somebody in my organization is going to show up and say, it's not 75, Andy. It's 130. Here's the 55 you didn't list.
Yeah.
But if I don't list the 75, I'll never get the 55. So let me just start with coverage of your controls. But I think at the high level, you're going to look at saying, there's some obviously known best practices around code hygiene that you're going to want to say, oh yes, we do input sanitization everywhere. Like that's just a norm. Like what are all of our norms? Input sanitization,
Yeah.
removing secrets from code, PII into vaults. List what those are and what percentage of your applications meet your standards.
Yeah.
And you should be able to defend every one of those standards. Like if
Yeah.
you say, oh, it's important that like every vulnerability is fixed in 30 days, I'm going to challenge you on that because most vulnerabilities don't actually need to be fixed in 30 days. There's some that do,
Yeah.
but there's a lot that it's like, oh, we're doing like regular maintenance fixes. As long as we're within 90 days, great. Okay, what percentage of the time are you within 90 days? That should be, every SLA should be met 85% of the time. 15% you're going to miss your SLA. That's okay. Document, understand why, clean up. But if you're aiming for 100% SLA, your organization's going to hate you.
That's awesome. Last question is around the topic of ASPM.
Yep.
From a CISO's perspective, how do I know that I need it and I need it now? What's your perspective on that?
So I think the answer is if your revenue stream relies on some application that other people are interacting with or using, you
Yeah.
probably need this now
Yeah.
because you don't know what you don't know. Like if you have manually built an ASPM program,
Yeah.
fantastic. Like if you could answer all the questions that came up here, you've got a metric for coverage for each of these things, you functionally have a homegrown ASPM. You should consider like how many people it takes to collect the data. Could you use a different ASPM program to let those people do something more valuable? But I think if you don't have applications, like ASPM is probably not the right thing for you.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. That's super relevant. And I think it's also the other angle is, size of organization, right? If you
Yep.
might be too small for an ASPM, but if you're just the right size, or you don't have the visibility, like you mentioned, you're going to need something like that, right?
Yeah, like if you're a small organization and you can itemize and name every application off the top of your head, and you
Yeah.
can hold your whole security program in your head, you are the ASPM, and that's okay. Like
Yeah.
I was that for Akamai in the very early days. Like it was me and one other person. We were the ASPM for the company.
Yeah.
At some point, that doesn't scale anymore.
Yeah. Exactly. Um, I think that's all we have time for questions. How do people get in touch with you, Andy? If they want to follow you, get in touch, speak with you.
Yeah, so they can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn are my most common platforms. I'm CSO Andy on both of those. I have you go to CISOandy.com to find me. I actually publish a newsletter. It's supposed to be weekly, but with the chaos of the last month, it's been more like fortnightly
Yeah,
that I publish. You can find the link there.
amazing. And if anybody needs any resources or any additional insight on ASPM, you can reach out to me at amir@scicode.com or just reach out via LinkedIn. You can also visit our website at scicode.com. We also have great resources on scicode.com/resources as well. Look out for the next episode. That's going to be launching soon. And thank you and have a great week. Thanks so much, Andy.
Thanks for having me, Amir.
Thanks.